Hi, I'm Steve Temes, an indoor air quality consultant specializing in building-related health effects. I've done extensive research in the scientific literature over a long period of time on chemical sensitivities and mold illness. And in this video, I want to explain the difference between immunogenic inflammatory responses and neurogenic inflammatory responses using the example of asthma and based on a scientific paper by William Meggs, MD. I will provide a link in the description, and essentially it can be thought of as the difference between allergic asthma and irritant asthma. The respiratory inflammatory response is an acquired hypersensitivity. People aren't born with asthma or born with allergic asthma or born with chemical sensitivity that results in asthmatic symptoms, also referred to as irritant asthma or reactive airways dysfunction syndrome. These are different mechanistic pathways resulting in the same inflammatory symptom of restrictive airways. And the diagnosis is not based on the trigger, the diagnosis is based on the symptoms. And using that example, I want to explain the difference between an allergy to mold and a hypersensitivity to mold contaminants, particularly microbial volatile organic compounds, which are recognized by the olfactory sense as mold odors, but the chemosensory mechanism is not the smell causing the symptoms. It is a different set of chemoreceptors that trigger a neurogenic inflammatory response. So this table is from the Meggs paper referenced in the description, distinguishes immunogenic versus neurogenic asthma based on the triggering mechanism, where the trigger of true allergic inflammation is a protein molecule, and that is mediated by an IgE antibody created by the adaptive immune system in the process of allergic sensitization. And the neurogenic inflammatory response is triggered by a volatile organic chemical compound sensed by chemical irritant receptors in the body. And to further elaborate on those chemosensory mechanisms, I'll only go so far as to suggest people look into solitary chemosensory cells and the chemesthetic sense, which is beyond what I want to get into in this video. But one is mediated by inflammation is mediated by histamine release from mast cells, and the other is neuropeptide release stimulating sensory nerves. And here you can see the neuropeptides listed here: substance P, neurokinin A, that you don't hear much about because these things are not well studied. And there's some crossover, what Meggs refers to as the switching neurogenic switching phenomenon, whereby histamine release also stimulates sensory nerves, and the neuropeptide release also stimulates mast cell degranulation. And the end result is inflammation, bronchial inflammation resulting in asthma, which occurs by two distinct mechanisms. And that's where I'm using this as a basis for understanding that other inflammatory responses related to mold can be immunogenic and or neurogenic. So the distinction between allergic asthma and irritant asthma, immunologic versus neurogenic, is much better understood than the distinction between mold allergy and mold related illness having to do with chemical hypersensitivity. The microbial volatile organic compounds that are present in these water damaged buildings, mold contaminated homes, is a different type of hypersensitivity trigger, and the volatile chemicals from mold are often where people who have fragrance sensitivities first became chemically sensitized, so that the spreading phenomenon, which is common term in chemical sensitivity circles, where the volatile organic compounds generated by fungal colonies, mold odors, if you will, are very similar in their chemical structure to fragrance compounds. That is, their carbon chain length and functional groups, alcohols, aldehydes, ketones, acetates. The chemicals are similar, and the chemoreception mechanisms that are created as a result of induction of sensitization react similarly and over time more broadly to these similar types of chemicals. So not only are mold-related symptoms explained better by understanding induction of chemical sensitization, it also explains how people who become chemically sensitized in mold-contaminated buildings develop additional chemical sensitivities, which is often, the multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome. In my experience, often I think begins with exposure in water damaged buildings. The sense of smell and the sense of taste do not explain the sensation of heat or coolness with regard to ingestion of hot pepper or hot ginger or hot cinnamon, or the York peppermint patty sensation of coolness, or the menthol sensation of coolness. There are more than 5 senses, and in the case of mold illness, acquired chemical hypersensitivities explain the symptoms much better than mycotoxin exposure. Mycotoxin exposure results in toxic endpoints. Aflatoxin poisoning, stachybotrys there's no arguing that a toxic dose of these naturally occurring toxins, that's why they're called toxins, they have toxic effects, but that isn't what we see in patients with mold-related illness. In my case, I see them as clients, not patients. But what they're describing are not toxic effects. They're describing, when they tell me about their symptoms, neurogenic effects, which can, especially on a chronic basis, result in severe autonomic nervous system dysregulation, including adrenal fatigue, including rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia symptoms, chronic migraines, chronic fatigue, sleep disorders. All of these things are related to nervous system dysfunction, dysregulation, not poisoning by mycotoxins.